Everyone expected a charming late-night interview, until Stephen Colbert traded his smile for accusations, and Denzel Washington stopped being a guest and became something far more dangerous. What unfolded wasn't a conversation, it was a quiet war between legacy and ego, truth and spectacle. And when Colbert pushed too far, Denzel didn't raise his voice, he raised the room's conscience. What you're about to see wasn't scripted, it was a reckoning. The studio was loud, too loud. Stage lights danced across an eager crowd, phones held high, cheers echoing from wall to wall. But just a few feet behind the curtain, it was dead silent. Denzel Washington stood alone, staring into the mirror of a cramped green room. He adjusted the cuffs on his dark navy suit, then paused. His fingers hovered over a small silver cross stitched onto his lapel, simple, quiet, almost hidden. He touched it once. Then his wedding band, a breath, steady, grounded. He didn't rehearse lines, he didn't scroll headlines. Just stood still, as if listening for something deeper than noise. A knock. "Mr. Washington, you're up." He nodded without turning. The hallway to the stage was a tunnel of blur, producers buzzing, interns waving clipboards, applause signs blinking red. But Denzel walked like the floor itself answered to each step. Slow, certain, not theatrical, intentional. Out front, Stephen Colbert wrapped his opening monologue with his trademark grin and practiced rhythm. The crowd loved it. Tonight's headliner was the reason. Colbert turned to the camera, grin locked in place, voice rising. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Academy Award-winning actor, the legendary Denzel Washington." The room erupted. It always did. Denzel stepped onto the stage under a flood of warm white lights, the kind meant to flatter and soften. He didn't smile big, just a nod, a handshake, a glance toward the audience. Then he sat calm, spine straight, a man clearly unbothered by the stage he'd just entered. The crowd hadn't noticed it yet, but something was different, not in the air, in the silence between the sounds. Colbert leaned in, tone breezy. "Denzel, great to have you back." "Appreciate that, Stephen," Denzel replied, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Let's talk." They did, at first. About his new film, a psychological thriller that pushed boundaries and blurred reality. Denzel spoke with his usual calm precision, his voice like a jazz saxophone in a quiet bar, slow, deliberate, resonant. He talked about the emotional toll of the role, the complexity of the character, the sacrifices on set. The audience was locked in, nodding, laughing gently where they were supposed to. Everything felt smooth, polished. Then something shifted. It was subtle, a twitch in Colbert's smile, a slight lean forward. His fingers tapped twice on his cue cards, a beat-off rhythm. His tone thinned just enough to catch a change. "You've always had a reputation for intensity," he began, voice syrupy but sharp, "for really owning your space on set. But recently, some reports have come out." Denzel didn't blink. Colbert continued, "I've got to ask, there are people saying you've been, let's say, challenging to work with." "Challenging how?" Denzel asked, voice steady as glass. "Well," Colbert feigned a chuckle, eyes narrowing. "There are anonymous sources who claim you've made excessive demands, created tension. Some even say you've made sets difficult." A flicker, not rage, not fear. Just a stillness that fell over Denzel's expression like a curtain. His voice didn't rise. It dropped barely but heavy. "You're quoting anonymous gossip," he said. "That's what we're doing now." The room tensed, not visibly. But the laughter died, replaced by the sound of nothing at all. Colbert tried to smile through it. "Some of these accounts are detailed. Are you saying none of it's true?" "I'm saying," Denzel leaned forward just slightly, "that I've shown up on sets for over 30 years. On time, prepared, respectful. You want the truth? Ask the people who were actually there, not the ones hiding behind keyboards." There was no applause, not yet, just breath held. Like everyone in the room realized they had crossed an invisible line but hadn't yet seen the consequence. Colbert regrouped. Well, speaking of truth, he pivoted fast, let's talk about your comments on pay equity in Hollywood. Some critics have said your activism rings a little hollow, that it's easy for someone who's made tens of millions to talk about fairness. Denzel's jaw shifted slightly, not clenched, just aware. Let me be clear, he said. Comfort doesn't erase conviction. I don't speak on fairness because it helps my image. I speak because I've seen what this business does to people who don't have a platform. He paused. I've taken pay cuts so someone else on the set could get what they deserve. I've said no to projects that didn't respect the crew. That's not branding, that's responsibility. Colbert cut in again, quicker now. But isn't it different when it comes from someone already successful? I mean, isn't it safe? What's safe, Denzel said, voice even lower now, is staying quiet, pretending injustice doesn't exist just because it doesn't touch you. He looked out into the audience, not for validation, but for orientation. I wasn't raised to stay silent while people get left behind, not on my watch. And for a moment, the room forgot it was a late-night show. The lights felt colder, the laughter wasn't coming back. The man they had invited to talk about a movie had just placed a mirror in the middle of their stage, and no one quite knew what they looked like anymore. Colbert shifted in his seat. Not visibly uncomfortable, but subtly off balance, like a man who expected a polite guest and got a steel wall instead. He glanced down at his cue cards, then back up, smiling too wide for the moment. Well, you've certainly made your position clear, he said, chuckling hollowly. But I think the public also has a right to ask questions, don't you think? Denzel didn't move. Depends who's really asking. Colbert's smile thinned. Okay, let's not be coy. There have been multiple reports, credible ones from insiders, people close to productions. They say you've become, let's say, difficult, that there's tension when you walk onto set, that crew members feel intimidated. Denzel leaned back slowly, crossing one leg over the other, calm, measured, like a man in a courtroom who's seen the trick coming before the first question was even asked. I've worked with hundreds of people across decades, he said. You want to talk facts? I'll give you names, crews I've eaten lunch with, directors I've gone to funerals with, colleagues I've stood beside when no one else would. But if what you have is a stack of anonymous whispers, then we're not talking about truth. We are talking about drama, manufactured, marketable, disposable. Colbert raised his eyebrows, mock casual. So you're saying none of it is true? I'm saying, Denzel replied, if you won't name them, don't use them. If you can't verify, don't weaponize. Especially not on a stage dressed up like a conversation. There was a brief pause, the kind that always feels longer on live television. A few people in the crowd shifted in their seats. No laughter now, no polite claps, just tension. Colbert tried again, more pointed. So you're not denying the accounts that you yelled at a young camera assistant on the set of The Pale Hour until she walked off crying. Denzel didn't blink. Then name her, or apologize to the women you're using as props for a headline. The studio air turned heavy. You're not here to protect anyone, Denzel continued, softer now, but somehow sharper. You're here to score points. To paint a picture with no brush, no paint, just shadows. And now you want me to play along, smile, defend myself against ghosts. Colbert tried to pivot. It's not personal. Denzel cut him off, gently. It is when it's my name. And for a moment, the weight of that name seemed to press down on the room. Denzel Washington, not the celebrity, not the headline, the man, the father, the son of a preacher and a hairdresser. The actor who had never once had a public scandal tied to his name in over 40 years, and who now sat in a chair across from a host who wanted to reduce him to clickbait. Colbert leaned forward, pressing again. I'm just doing what the public wants, asking the questions that need to be asked. Denzel looked directly at him, then into the camera. No, what the public wants is something real, something rooted. They're tired of performance dressed as journalism. And tonight, Stephen, that's what you brought. Not truth, not fairness, just theater. In the shadows, off stage, a junior producer lowered her clipboard. One of the studio interns, maybe 23, stared wide-eyed at the exchange. Somewhere in the back, a cameraman turned slightly to his left, just enough to break eye contact with what he was filming. Colbert cleared his throat. "Let's move on." Denzel interrupted again, not to be rude, but because the moment demanded it. "You started this," he said. "You lit the match, and now that it's warm, you want to pretend it's just atmosphere." He smiled faintly. "Nah, if we're gonna talk truth, let's stay here for a while." For the first time since the opening applause, the entire studio fell utterly, fully silent. Not one cough, not one shuffle, just breath held. And under the hot lights, it was Colbert's stage anymore. It belonged to the man who didn't raise his voice, because he didn't have to. Colbert sat back, but his shoulders betrayed the smile still hanging on his face. He was recalibrating, looking for higher ground, but the room had shifted. It no longer pulsed with audience energy, it hovered in anticipation. He shuffled his cards like a nervous habit, then landed on his next angle. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "since we're on the subject of truth and responsibility, let's talk about something you've spoken passionately about: pay equity in Hollywood. You've called for more fairness in how actors, especially actors of color, are compensated. Admirable, sure, but some say it's a little rich coming from someone who's already made tens of millions." Denzel didn't flinch. He sat with that same quiet posture, the kind that made it clear he wasn't caught off guard. He was just choosing how to respond. "Let me ask you something," he said, voice low but direct. "When you see a man with something to lose, speak up anyway. Does that make him arrogant or accountable?" Colbert hesitated. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Denzel continued. "I'm asking for context. I've walked into rooms where people smiled in my face, then cut someone else's deal behind the door. I've sat across tables where talent got shortchanged, not because they weren't brilliant, but because they weren't white, or weren't loud, or weren't connected." The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They built like bricks laid in a pattern no one could stop watching. "I've taken pay cuts," Denzel said plainly, "so another actor, someone just starting out, could get what they deserved. Not what they were told to accept. I've passed on roles that paid more because the story did honor who we are. And I've stood up for crew members who weren't even on the call sheet." He paused, just long enough for the audience to feel it. "That's not branding, that's not image, that's my name. My father didn't raise me to chase spotlight. He raised me to walk in it with clean hands." A single cough from somewhere in the rafters, then nothing. Colbert tried to smile it off. "But you'd agree it's easier to speak out once you've already made it, right? I mean, you're not risking your career anymore." Denzel nodded, slowly. "You'd think so." He leaned in just slightly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "But let me tell you something, Stephen. Speaking up doesn't just risk contracts. It risks silence. It risks the comfortable invitations. It risks being called difficult by hosts on national television." Colbert's smile froze for half a second. "What's safe," Denzel said, his voice now smooth as ice, "is staying quiet. What's safe is watching injustice and telling yourself it's not your problem." But I wasn't built for that kind of safety. For a brief moment, he looked out toward the audience again, not to command them, not to perform, but like a man scanning for a compass. "When I speak about fairness, it's not to check a box. It's because I've seen people I admire, people more talented than me, leave this business broken. And I've had to look in the mirror and ask myself, what did I do with my platform?" He looked back at Colbert, dead center, no smile, no anger, just weight. Because legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you protect while you're still here. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, barely audible but real. A few heads nodding, some just staring. Colbert straightened. He wasn't losing control, but he wasn't steering either. He was riding the edge of something deeper than he had expected, and now it was too late to pull back. He cleared his throat again. Okay, well, speaking of legacy, some critics say your silence on certain issues is strategic, that you only speak when it benefits you. Denzel almost smiled. Almost. You want to know what's strategic? He said, holding your tongue when your family name S in the crosshairs, saying no to interviews that only want you when you're angry, choosing principle over performance. His tone never rose, but his words didn't leave room for oxygen. You think silence is safe. Sometimes it's the only honest choice. A quiet beat passed. But tonight, he said, settling deeper into the chair, tonight I'm not being silent. And no one dared to speak over him. Colbert glanced down at his cards again, but this time it was different. He wasn't referencing them, he was hiding behind them. The audience could feel it. The shift was no longer subtle. Denzel wasn't simply navigating questions, he was commanding the space, with silence, with steadiness. And Colbert, a man known for control, now looked like someone slowly realizing the fire he lit was no longer under his control. Then Colbert leaned in. Well, he said with exaggerated casualness, let's not pretend you haven't had your moments. There's a pattern, Denzel, tension on set, directors pushed out, people quitting. One production assistant claimed you yelled at her until she cried. That doesn't sound like responsibility. That sounds like intimidation. The word hung in the air like a blade dropped on tile. Denzel didn't move right away. He let it sit, let it echo, then leaned forward, not fast, not slow, just enough to remind everyone in the room that he chose this moment. Name her, he said quietly, or apologize to every woman you've ever used as cover for a ratings grab. The studio went dead still. Even the cameras seemed to stop humming. Let me tell you what's actually intimidating, he continued, voice low but sharp, hiding behind anonymous sources and calling it accountability, throwing shadows and calling them facts, weaponizing someone else's pain for applause you didn't earn. Colbert tried to cut in. I'm just doing my job. No, Denzel said, holding his gaze. Your job is to host a show, to hold a conversation, not to play judge, jury, and executioner in front of a live audience with no evidence. The silence wasn't awkward anymore, it was alive. Like the room itself had become an audience to something more honest than any monologue could deliver. You want to talk about tension? Denzel said. Try being the only black man on a set where the only other person who looks like you is holding a boom mic. Try walking into a room full of suits that don't want you to speak, they just want you to smile. Then tell me about tension. His voice didn't rise, it narrowed, focused. Creative work isn't always polite, it's supposed to challenge. It's supposed to disrupt. That's not dysfunction, that's collaboration. The only people who think silence equals harmony are the ones who have never been forced to hold back just to keep their job. Colbert sat frozen, unsure whether to respond or absorb. Behind him, his stage manager had stopped giving cues. The monitors were still rolling, but no one dared blink. And by the way, Denzel added, eyes locked, I didn't yell at that assistant. I stayed late that night to help her block a scene no one else had time for. Ask her, don't quote shadows. Colbert opened his mouth, then closed it again. You don't get to point fingers from behind a curtain, Denzel said. You don't get to build a trap out of rumors, spring it on national TV, then pretend it's journalism. From the front row, a woman in her 60s, dressed conservatively, clutching a small purse, nodded once slowly. Her face said what no applause could. This is different. Colbert reached for a line, any line. People just want to understand who they're supporting. No, Denzel cut him off. What they want is the truth, and you came here with gossip. He leaned back again, but it didn't feel like retreat. It felt like judgment had been passed. You can't hide behind questions when your intent is already clear. Colbert adjusted his tie. I think you're being too sensitive. Denzel blinked once, slowly. You ambush a man with rumors, question his integrity, and when he defends himself, you call it sensitive. He let that land. Then he looked around the studio, at the cameras, the staff, the lights, then back at Colbert. No, what's sensitive is your ego. What I'm doing is what men do when they've spent a lifetime being expected to take it and smile. He leaned in one last time. I'm not your scandal, Stephen. I'm not your headline. I came here with a name I've spent 40 years building, and I won't let you reduce it to a segment. And that was when the audience truly went silent, not out of discomfort, but reverence. Something had just happened, not a performance, not a viral moment. A line had been drawn, and only one man was still standing on the right side of it. Colbert sat frozen, the smile on his face now fully hollow, like a mask someone forgot to take off after the performance ended. The studio was locked in stasis. No laughter, no movement, just the kind of stillness that only follows when truth refuses to be softened. He reached again for his cards, but this time, even the act of holding them looked desperate. So you're walking away? He asked, voice thinner now, because it got uncomfortable. Denzel stood, slowly, not dramatically, just deliberately. Like a man standing for something, not walking away from anything. He didn't look angry, he didn't look shaken, he looked done. I'm not walking because it got uncomfortable, Denzel said. I'm walking because this stopped being honest 5 questions ago. The crowd didn't cheer, they didn't clap, they just watched, the way people watch a verdict. You brought cue cards, he continued, adjusting his jacket. I brought 40 years of work. You came here to catch a moment. I came here carrying a name that's fed generations, taught students, saved boys from gangs, built scholarships, built trust, and you tried to trade that for a soundbite. He stepped around the chair and paused in front of the host's desk. Then, gently, almost reverently, he reached to his lapel and removed the small clip-on mic. The room watched as he set it on Colbert's desk. It landed with barely a sound, but somehow it hit like thunder. That's not a mic, Denzel said. That's the line between truth and theater, and I don't perform for people who call integrity a liability. Colbert tried to regain footing. We're just having a conversation. I'm asking what the public wants to know. No, Denzel cut in sharper now. You're asking what will trend. There's a difference. He took a step toward center stage. His back was to Colbert, but his voice remained crystal clear. You don't get to accuse a man with no evidence and then call it discussion. You don't get to dress up gossip in studio lighting and call it journalism. A few people in the audience began to shift, glancing at each other. Some were leaning forward now, not to catch the drama, but because they recognized they were witnessing something real. Something that wasn't meant to be consumed, but understood. You asked why I don't speak out more, Denzel continued. Because when I do, this is what happens. A man sits across from me with a grin and a script and calls it accountability. You're not holding me to truth, Stephen. You're holding me to expectations you never applied to yourself. Colbert's voice cracked slightly as he tried to respond. You think I'm the villain here. Denzel stopped mid-stage, then turned back. I think you're what happens when ego meets access. The words didn't boom. They didn't need to. The silence after them said everything. Let me explain something to you, Denzel said, walking back to the desk. The most dangerous thing in the world isn't a man who's angry. It's a man who's calm, because he's already made peace with walking away. He nodded once toward the crowd, not seeking their applause, just acknowledging them. Then, to Colbert. This was never a conversation. It was a setup with a timer, and you were hoping I'd explode. But I don't explode, Stephen, I endure. He looked down at the mic, still sitting on the desk. You should try it sometime. And just like that, he turned and walked, not hurried, not triumphant, just real, just done. The studio did erupt. It didn't need to, it breathed. Slowly. in one long, collective exhale, as if the room itself had finally caught up to the truth it had just witnessed. Colbert didn't move. He sat behind his desk, cards limp in hand, the usual rhythm of the show broken beyond repair. His crew was silent in their booths. The cameras kept rolling, but there was no cue to follow, no laughter to time. Just a man still seated, trying to salvage control of something that had slipped far beyond his reach. He called out, voice sharp but strained, "Denzel, sit down, we're not done." Denzel paused mid-step, turned slowly and looked at him, not with anger, not even with contempt, but with something quieter, something heavier. "Oh, we're done," he said, "because I don't stay where respect left the room." Colbert leaned forward, trying to find his edge again. "This is live television. You walking out makes it look like you can't handle the questions." Denzel blinked once, then took a slow step back toward the center of the stage. "No, Stephen," he said, voice like calm water against steel. "This makes it look like I know when a conversation becomes a performance, and when a performance becomes a trap." He took another step, closer now. The lights caught his lapel again. That small silver cross, barely visible from the front rows, now gleamed in full view under the rig. "You keep calling this journalism," Denzel continued, "but journalism has sources, integrity, courage. What you did was theater, manufactured tension, dressed up as truth." Colbert scoffed. "I just asked what people want to know." "No," Denzel replied. "You asked what your segment producer handed you. You looked me in the eye and pretended it was neutral. That's not curiosity, that's strategy." For the first time, Colbert didn't respond right away. His fingers tapped nervously against the desk, his signature smirk fraying at the corners. "You think this is unfair?" he finally asked, voice rising a little. "You think you're the only one who gets questioned? You think you're above the fire?" Denzel stepped closer, one step. That was all it took to make the whole studio lean in. "No," he said, "I think I've been walking through fire since before I was invited to your stage." He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. "I've been walking through fire since Hollywood treated men who looked like me as risks. Since directors smiled at me in daylight and rewrote scripts behind my back at night. Since producers offered me roles that required me to die just to prove I had range." He stepped even closer, now only a few feet from Colbert's desk. "And through all of it, I said yes, I showed up, I delivered, I kept my name clean, and I made sure the door stayed open for the ones coming after me." The room had gone beyond quiet now. It was reverent. "So no, Stephen, I don't run from fire, I just don't dance for it." He let that sit. "You wanted a moment. You wanted a man to snap, to break, to become a headline you could ride into the next news cycle. But I didn't come here to be broken. I came here to draw the line." Colbert raised his voice now, defensive. "This is what accountability looks like." Denzel tilted his head. "Accountability," he repeated. "For what? For longevity? For using my platform without performing pain? You don't want accountability, you want a crack. You want me to bleed, so you can frame it as transparency." He turned to the crowd now, not for applause, but clarity. "And this," he said, "this right here is why people don't trust media. Not because we fear questions, but because the questions aren't clean. They come with hooks, with traps, with edits waiting backstage." He looked back at Colbert. "You call that fair? I call it what it is, exploitation." Colbert sat silent. No defense, no pivot, just a man watching his own script collapse in real time. Denzel nodded once, final. "I didn't come here to perform," he said. "I came here to not be erased." And the weight of that landed like a closing gavel. Denzel turned from the stage, not rushed, not theatrical, just deliberate. Each step he took was silent, but it echoed louder than anything spoken that night. No music played. No outro rolled. Just the sound of a room holding its breath as a man walked away with something most guests never bring and most hosts never expect: intact dignity. He passed the edge of the curtain. The lights behind him dimmed slightly, like even the studio itself understood what had just happened. In the wings, a young producer stepped aside, eyes wide, clipboard lowered, like she'd just seen something sacred. Not a meltdown. Not a scandal. A man who refused to be rewritten. Backstage, Denzel didn't speak. He sat on a small wooden bench, removed the mic cord from under his collar, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table beside him. He looked down at his hands. They didn't tremble. He adjusted the ring on his finger, then rested his palms on his knees. For the first time that night, he exhaled. He didn't look angry, he looked tired. But not the kind of tired that comes from confrontation. The kind that comes from carrying a standard for decades in rooms that still ask you to prove it. Inside the studio, Colbert remained frozen behind the desk. His cue cards sat untouched. His smirk had vanished. For once, he wasn't playing a role. He was just exposed. He looked around the room for a laugh, a line, a way back into control. None came. The audience didn't boo him. They didn't cheer him. They just watched, silent, processing. Someone in the third row finally clapped once, then twice, but no one joined, not yet. It wasn't the kind of night that ended in applause. It was the kind of night that ended in thought. Colbert tried to salvage it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the void, that was Denzel Washington here to talk about his new film. But no one cared about the film anymore. Somewhere online, clips had already begun to circulate. The moment Denzel leaned in, the moment he said, "I came here to not be erased," the moment he placed the microphone on the desk like a verdict. By morning, his words would be printed in headlines, shared in group chats, echoed on podcasts. But those who watched it live, who sat in that room, wouldn't remember just the quotes. They'd remember the stillness, the tension, the cold unraveling of a performance disguised as journalism, and the man who never once raised his voice but still managed to silence an entire room. Backstage, Denzel stood, adjusted his jacket. He didn't wait for an escort. He didn't ask for a car. He simply walked down the hallway, past the dressing rooms, past the cables and the wires and the buzz of a show still on air. One of the crew members, a young man with a headset, nodded at him. No words. Just respect. Before turning the corner, Denzel paused. He looked back toward the stage he'd just left behind. He didn't speak. He didn't shake his head. He didn't smile. He just stood there for a second, looking at the closed world behind him, and then said quietly, to no one, or maybe to God, "You don't get to define me with gossip. I already defined myself with work." And then he walked away. No mic drop, no curtain call, just a man who never needed the last word, because the truth spoke for him.